It was a photograph that could have been mistaken for any ordinary family portrait from the small towns that dotted America in the early years of the 20th century. A mother, neatly dressed in a high-collared blouse of fine cotton, her hair pinned back with the care of a woman accustomed to order. Two children, a boy and a girl, posed stiffly on either side of a man whose dark suit and neatly pressed shirt betrayed both his pride and his awareness of the camera's unblinking lens. The studio, a modest brick building on Main Street, was called Harrison and Sons, and its polished wood floors and painted backdrops were known in town for producing photographs that families would treasure for decades. Yet the image that survived the years would reveal a quiet horror not immediately apparent to the casual eye. The father's hand rested on his son's shoulder, but it was a hand that refused to relax, that seemed rigid beyond what the pose required. The fingers were unnaturally straight, the knuckles slightly swollen, the skin pale with a faint greenish cast that, once examined closely, hinted at something gone very wrong. This was Arthur Whitman, a railway clerk known to his neighbors as courteous and diligent, a man whose life had been consumed by both work and the quiet duty of family. Official records would mark his death in April 1907, and yet the photograph, dated the same month, captured him in a pose that suggested he was still very much alive. Dr. Helen Crowthorne, a historian who had spent decades cataloging early American photography, came across the image in 1989 in a private collection purchased from an estate sale in Ohio. At first glance, it seemed charming, a standard Edwardian-style studio portrait, the sort of picture one might see framed in a parlor or tucked into an album. But the hand, Arthur's hand, drew her attention. Magnified under a desk lamp, the stiffness of the joints and the faint discoloration could not be dismissed. A search of local records revealed a startling fact. Arthur Whitman had died 3 days before the sitting. Letters from Lydia Whitman, the mother, written to her sister in the months surrounding her husband's death, painted a picture of domestic strain and quiet desperation. One note, dated April 25, 1907, read, "Arthur's stomach troubles are worsening. The doctor does not know how to help him. I do not know how to keep him upright, and I fear the children see more than I can bear." Another, written just a day before the photograph was taken, hinted at her intentions. "If he will not stay with us, I will bring him, even if only for a moment, so the children may have their memory intact." These words, when viewed a century later, suggested a mother caught between mourning and a need to preserve the semblance of family life, even as reality had shifted into tragedy. Thomas Whitman, the 8-year-old son, remembered only fragments of the day. In his later diary entries, written decades afterward, he recalled sitting beside his father and trying to mimic the rigid posture that the photographer demanded. "Mother says Papa will not wake, but she wants him to sit for our picture, so he'll be with us always," he wrote in a trembling script. That small, innocent reflection captured the tension of the moment. A child unaware that the man next to him had already crossed the boundary between life and death, and a mother determined to hold onto a fleeting sense of normality. The studio records, preserved in the Harrison archives, noted the sitting as having taken place on April 28, 1907. The photographer, a man named Samuel Harrison, later recounted in an interview, "She brought him in, laid him carefully in the chair, propped him upright, and instructed the children where to stand. I've seen many families grieving, but this was different. She wanted him present. I did what I could to make it appear natural." There was no hint of malice in his words, only a quiet acknowledgement of something unnatural and profoundly sad. Arthur's death certificate, filed with the county registrar, listed chronic arsenical poisoning as the cause of death. At the time, it was assumed to be accidental, the kind of poisoning that might occur from exposure to contaminated wallpaper or household chemicals. both common in small-town homes of the era. Yet a century later, forensic analysis suggested a more complex story. Dr. Sarah Houghton, a chemist specializing in early 20th century toxicology, would later examine samples of Arthur's hair and nails. Her report concluded that arsenic had accumulated over weeks rather than days, a slow ingestion pattern that suggested either long-term environmental exposure or deliberate dosing. This evidence did not necessarily implicate Lydia Whitman in a crime. There were, after all, mercurial powders, tonics, and other remedies that were widely used in households at the time, often without clear understanding of their risks. It was conceivable that Lydia, herself the daughter of a small-town apothecary, believed she was caring for her husband with what knowledge she had, administering treatments that inadvertently hastened his death. The photograph, however, made one fact undeniable. She had arranged for him to sit upright beside their children after his passing. The act was deliberate, and it was her choice. Neighbors recalled seeing Lydia leave the house that day, carrying a small bundle of letters, a pocket watch, and the children. She returned hours later with the photograph tucked under her arm, wet from the developer's tray. One woman, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, would later recount, "I thought I saw a shadow of him moving, but I knew it was only my eyes playing tricks." She did not speak of it, and we did not ask. There was a quiet that settled over the house after that day. In those few sentences lay the essence of the tension that had gripped the household, the intersection of grief, denial, and the human desire to preserve memory. Arthur's son, Thomas, would carry the photograph into adulthood, never displaying it openly. He married, had children of his own, and kept the image locked in a drawer. Only after his death did the diary surface, clarifying the mother's intent. It was not meant to deceive the world, only to soothe the unbearable absence of the man they loved. Lydia Whitman herself vanished from local records in 1910, leaving town under her maiden name, possibly to escape gossip or perhaps to start anew after a series of tragedies that had claimed her husband and reshaped her family forever. The photograph itself, developed on thick cardstock and carefully preserved, shows subtle details that were invisible to contemporaries. The slight tilt of the father's head, the unnatural straightness of his fingers, the faint pallor of the skin, all combine to create a tableau that is both intimate and profoundly unsettling. The children's expressions are carefully controlled. The mother's hands, folded tightly in her lap, betray a tension that the casual observer might not register. It is a photograph that rewards scrutiny, offering insight into grief, ritual, and the ways humans attempt to impose order on chaos. Dr. Crowthorne, upon publishing her findings, noted that such post-mortem photography was not uncommon in rural America of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet what made this image extraordinary was the combination of timing, composition, and the subtle evidence of poisoning that the father's hand unwittingly revealed. "It is a record of a moment between life and death," she wrote, capturing a mother's need to preserve family unity, even when reality had already fractured it. The historian's words framed the photograph not as evidence of guilt, but as a window into human emotion at its most complicated and sorrowful. The quiet streets of Cedarville, Ohio, in the spring of 1907, bore the usual rhythms of small-town life. Horses clattered along brick roads, the clang of the railway echoed from the station near the town center, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted from Mrs. Langley's bakery on Main Street. Yet in one modest home at the edge of town, on a narrow lane lined with blossoming dogwoods, the Whitman household was already marked by absence. Arthur Whitman, once the steady heart of the family, was gone. The official record claimed chronic arsenical poisoning, a tragic but ultimately unremarkable hazard of the era. The truth, however, was far more intricate, and it lay hidden in plain sight in the photograph that had captured him 3 days after his death. Neighbors remembered Arthur as methodical, deliberate, and unassuming. He had begun his career with the Erie Railroad as a clerk, rising slowly through diligence and reliability. In letters preserved by the local historical society, he described his work with quiet pride. One, dated February 12, 1907, to his brother-in-law, read, "The day passes slowly, but the ledger is my companion, and the men at the station are fair. Lydia worries more than I do about the children, but I am content if they are safe and fed." Yet, even in these mundane reflections, hints of the man's fragility emerge. Complaints of nausea, trembling fingers, and exhaustion weave through his otherwise calm descriptions. It was these subtle physical complaints that would later take on a darker significance. Dr. Edwin Ray, a physician who had known the Whitmans for years, kept careful notes in his ledgers. Patient exhibits pallor, slight tremor in right hand, complains of persistent abdominal discomfort, he recorded on March 3, 1907. At the time, the town lacked the facilities or expertise to diagnose chronic arsenic exposure. Ray prescribed tonics and dietary adjustments, nothing more invasive. He described Lydia as attentive but anxious, a woman fiercely protective of her husband, yet prone to worry that bordered on obsession. By mid-April, Arthur's condition worsened. Friends recalled seeing him pale and quiet, his hands shaking slightly when he lifted a teacup. One local grocer, Mr. Henry Toller, remembered Lydia purchasing large quantities of a medicinal powder labeled Dr. Fairchild's Stomach Elixir. "She said it might help him settle," Toller later testified, "but I knew the stuff had a strong smell of arsenic. Everyone in town used it sometimes." In hindsight, these details became ominous. The elixir contained compounds that were dangerous if taken in sustained doses, and the faint greenish tint seen on Arthur's hand in the photograph matched the expected effects of chronic exposure. Lydia's own writings, preserved in letters to her sister Margaret, reveal a mind caught between hope and despair. "I try to keep him upright, but the strength fades, and I fear the children will remember him as a ghost," she wrote on April 22, 1907. "If only a photograph could hold him just once more, as he was, alive in our home." There is a mixture of maternal devotion and subtle unease in her words, a woman trying to preserve normalcy while confronting the inexorable reality of death. The inquest following Arthur's death, convened on April 27th, provided further context. Coroner Frederick Poole, whose attention to detail was uneven, relied heavily on Dr. Ray's testimony. Witnesses spoke of Arthur's pallor, his lingering weakness, and the medications Lydia administered. "I cannot swear that she acted with ill intent," Ray said, "but the quantities and frequency of the powders could have hastened his decline. I do not blame her. I only observe what the man endured." Poole concluded that death was accidental, the result of household exposure rather than malice. Yet contemporaneous notes hint at his own ambivalence. A scribbled margin in his ledger reads, "Too neat, too precise, or too clever." Even as the official verdict was rendered, Lydia's actions that day demonstrated a tension between mourning and preservation. The family photograph session was arranged with meticulous care. Samuel Harrison, the studio photographer, remembered Lydia arriving early, carrying Arthur, still supported in a chair by padded cushions and shawls. She instructed the children on how to stand, where to place their hands, and how to hold their expressions. Harrison later described her demeanor. She was quiet, but there was a tension, as if the room held its breath. "I tried to make the father's posture natural, but the body resisted, yet she insisted, calmly, firmly. She wanted this moment preserved." This insistence sparked curiosity decades later among historians and forensic experts. The combination of physical evidence in the photograph, the rigidity of the father's hand, the subtle pallor of his face, the positioning of his limbs, suggested not merely a grieving widow, but a calculated effort to create the illusion of life. The psychological complexity of the act is what makes the image compelling. Lydia was performing a ritual of denial, one that required technical knowledge, careful timing, and a will strong enough to hold a dead man upright. The children, Thomas and Margaret, were instructed to behave as if nothing was unusual. Thomas would later describe in his private diaries the strangeness of that day. "I remember trying to smile, trying to be still, because Mother said Papa needed us to sit together. I did not understand. I only knew he would not wake." Margaret, only 5, would recall in a later family interview, "He smelled different. He did not move when I touched him, but Mother said he was watching us. I believed her." Their accounts highlight the ethical and emotional tension Lydia navigated. She preserved the family unit in appearance, but the cost was psychological exposure. For her children, a trauma hidden beneath the polite facade of Edwardian life. Local historians later noted that post-mortem photography, though more common in rural America than in urban centers, had declined sharply by 1907. Lydia's choice was increasingly unusual, making the photograph a rare instance of a family portrait staged after death in a middle-class household. Dr. Crowthorne, in her analysis, described it as a study in both loss and control. The mother could not prevent death, but she could dictate its presentation. Further investigation into household practices sheds light on the arsenic poisoning. Lydia's letters mention multiple remedies, powders, and tonics, all widely available, often recommended by traveling salesmen, and containing compounds that were poorly regulated. "If only I could make him well," she wrote. "I follow instructions exactly. I do not understand why he fades." It becomes apparent that Lydia's actions, while tragically misguided, were grounded in genuine concern, compounded by ignorance of the substance's lethality. The photograph itself served as a permanent record of both love and misjudgment. The father's hand, stiff and pale, betrayed the slow accumulation of toxins. The children's posture, rigid and instructed, reflected the unnatural circumstances. The mother's controlled expression masked fear, grief, and an effort to maintain dignity. Viewed in the present day, the image is a subtle but vivid forensic record of human error, a testament to the dangers of ignorance in an era before modern toxicology and medical oversight. By examining the context of Cedarville in 1907, the home, the medical practices, the social expectations of motherhood and family, historians can trace the confluence of circumstances that produced both tragedy and a striking photograph. The act of posing Arthur, whether viewed as devotion or denial, highlights the ways in which grief can shape human behavior, creating artifacts that endure far longer than the lives they depict. Decades after the photograph had been taken, long after the quiet streets of Cedarville had seen their children grow and leave for other towns, the image of the Whitman family returned to public attention. Dr. Helen Crowthorne, the historian who had first discovered the photograph in a private collection, had carefully cataloged every detail. She noted the father's hand, still rigid, the subtle color shift of his skin, the tension in the mother's hands, and the precise way the children were arranged. These details were more than artistic choices. They were physical records of grief, denial, and the slow, tragic impact of toxic substances in an era of limited medical knowledge. Modern forensic investigation, conducted by Dr. Sarah Houghton in the 1990s, confirmed what careful observation had suggested. Hair samples extracted from preserved locks of Arthur's hair stored in family scrapbooks revealed the presence of arsenic and traces of mercury. The pattern of accumulation, slow and continuous, indicated that Arthur had ingested the substances over weeks rather than days. The findings were consistent with Lydia's frequent use of medicinal powders designed to relieve what she believed were digestive or stomach ailments. What had been considered accidental death in 1907 was now understood as a tragic consequence of good intentions paired with ignorance of chemistry. Letters and diary entries unearthed during the investigation shed light on Lydia's perspective. In a note to her sister Margaret, Lydia reflected, "I did all I could to save him. I did not know that my care could harm. I only wanted him to remain with us, if even for a photograph." These words revealed a woman trapped between love, duty, and a misunderstanding of science. A woman whose devotion left her husband dead, yet preserved his presence in the image forever. Historians and psychologists alike have remarked on the duality of Lydia's act, both maternal and profoundly unsettling, simultaneously compassionate and misguided. Even the children, Thomas and Margaret, contributed to the story long after their mother's departure. Thomas's diary, discovered by a great-grandniece in 1987, contains reflections on memory, grief, and the photograph itself. "I understood much later what Mother had done. I saw him as he was, but also as she wanted him to remain. It was love, but it was also fear." Margaret, whose writings were shorter and more fragmented, expressed a similar ambivalence. "I remember his hand. I remember trying to make him real. I did not know then how fragile life is or how fragile memory can be." These personal recollections added depth to the image, transforming it from a simple studio portrait into a record of human emotion stretched to its limits. Historians examining Cedarville's small-town archives found that Lydia had left town within 3 years of her husband's death. She assumed her maiden name and moved to Dayton, Ohio, taking work as a seamstress. Local records indicate that she lived quietly, interacting with neighbors, but never discussing her past. No record suggests that she faced censure or accusation for Arthur's death. In this way, her story reflects not only personal tragedy, but also the societal norms of early 20th century America, where domestic affairs, particularly those involving illness or death, were rarely subjected to public scrutiny. Dr. Crowthorne emphasized the broader significance of the photograph. It was more than an artifact of grief. It was a lens into cultural, social, and medical history. In her published essay, she wrote, "The Whitman photograph illustrates the intersection of maternal instinct, limited medical knowledge, and the human desire to preserve memory. It is a visual testament to the ways ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. Through careful analysis of posture, expression, and physical evidence, modern scholars could reconstruct not only the event, but the emotional landscape of a family in crisis." The forensic findings also illuminated the limitations of early 20th century medicine. Dr. Houghton noted that even a trained physician like Dr. Edwin Ray had limited means to diagnose chronic poisoning, particularly when the cause was domestic powders and remedies commonly believed to be safe. The tragedy of Arthur Whitman underscores how easily human error, compounded by ignorance, can lead to irreversible consequences. Yet it also demonstrates the resilience of memory. The photograph, preserved for generations, ensured that this family's story endured. In public presentations, Dr. Houghton and Dr. Crowthorne emphasized the ethical dimensions of post-mortem photography. Lydia Whitman's choice to pose her deceased husband was not an act of cruelty, but an attempt to maintain family unity in the face of incomprehensible loss. The photograph's unnerving realism confronts contemporary audiences with questions of morality, grief, and the human impulse to hold on to what death seeks to take away. It also reveals how photographs, often considered passive records, can carry forensic and emotional truths that survive for generations. Letters between Lydia and her sister, alongside Thomas's later diary entries, reveal the private negotiations that defined the household's final days. Lydia wrote, "I will make them remember him as he should be, upright, present, our Father. Even if he cannot breathe, he can remain, and we can see him still." These words, chilling yet tender, reveal a mother attempting to impose order on chaos, crafting a memory in which her children could anchor their grief. In doing so, she created an artifact that would perplex generations, invite forensic scrutiny, and stand as a testament to the power of love, fear, and desperation intertwined. The children's own lives were subtly shaped by this early encounter with death and artifice. Thomas became a teacher, quietly, reflecting on the fragility of life and the importance of remembrance, while Margaret pursued a modest career in nursing, often recalling the lessons of observation, care, and attention to subtle detail instilled by her mother's actions. The photograph remained a silent teacher, demonstrating both the potency of human intention and the perils of unexamined remedies. By the late 20th century, advances in forensic science allowed investigators to understand what had been opaque for a century. Arsenic levels in hair and nails, the correlation with household powders, and the timing of administration painted a clear picture. Arthur Whitman's death, while tragic, was avoidable in an era of better medical knowledge. Lydia Whitman's act of post-mortem posing became the final layer of evidence, her careful orchestration preserved in the rigidity of a hand, the angle of a head, and the expression in her children's eyes. The photograph itself, now housed in a historical archive, continues to captivate and unsettle. Visitors remark on its beauty, its precision, and the quiet horror embedded in subtle gestures. The father's hand, once unnoticed, now commands attention. Historians, psychologists, and the general public alike find themselves confronting questions that transcend time. How do we mourn? How do we preserve memory? At what point does love cross into unintended harm? And how can a single image, frozen in a moment, reveal truths that words alone cannot convey? The final revelation, when fully understood, is neither sensational nor grotesque. It is human, tragic, and deeply instructive. Lydia Whitman acted out of love, misapplied through ignorance. Arthur Whitman's life ended not through malice, but through the subtle dangers of early 20th century domestic medicine. And yet, in the photograph, he remains present, a testament to maternal devotion, the fragility of life, and the persistence of memory. As the story closes, the audience is left to reflect on the ways in which ordinary objects, letters, diaries, photographs, serve as conduits for extraordinary understanding. The Whitman photograph is a lesson in history, science, and human emotion, a quiet record of grief, devotion, and error that endures across generations. It challenges us to consider how much of what we see is shaped by intention, how easily love can be entwined with harm, and how truth often lies hidden in plain sight. For those captivated by this account, the world of forgotten photographs offers endless possibilities. Behind each image is a story waiting to be uncovered, a hidden narrative of lives shaped by circumstance, choice, and the quiet persistence of memory. If you are drawn to these tales, to the subtle interplay of grief and history, subscribe and continue exploring. Share in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. Help us trace the paths of these stories across time and place. The Whitman photograph is one among many, and each one carries a truth waiting for those patient enough to see it.